What is up, guys, and welcome back to another video over here on YouTube. My name is Fernando, also known as JNandez 87. In today's video, we're going to break down the latest stream that I had on CoinPoker, playing the biggest stakes of my life by far, $501,000. We're going to see big pots here unfolding, 100K, 200K, 300K, even a $500,000 pot. And in some of those hands, I'll be involved. I break down the hands as we are recapping the stream. This is certainly a nerd episode. If you love PLO, if you want to learn more about behind the scenes and how to break down hands and how to think about spots, how I think about spots, then this is the right video for you. We will talk about the players on the table. We'll talk about the site in itself, CoinPoker. We'll talk about PLO Trainer. And of course, and most importantly, we will talk about all those big spots and pots that I was involved in. So to kick things off, CoinPoker is a website where players can play in a cryptocurrency called USDT. Now, USDT has a symbol similar to dollars or euros, and you can see this here in front of the actual amount. This is the USDT symbol, and the idea, or one of the ideas of USDT, is that it is pegged to the dollar. So essentially, one USDT is equivalent to $1. So you can look at these blinds here, or the amounts in the stacks, as dollar amounts. This game kicks off every Sunday at 10 a.m. Vegas time, 6 p.m. UK time. And that's also when I start my stream. By the way, this upcoming Sunday, there will be another big game. We'll see if the stakes are the same or just a little bit smaller, but basically no split stakes on CoinPoker on my channel next Sunday again, 10 a.m. Vegas time, 6 p.m. UK time. And to start things off, everyone sits down with 60,000 USDT. I'm just going to refer to this as dollars now, moving on, makes it a bit easier and practical. And that is 60 big blinds in this game. And now not everyone is dealt in, even though we're all sitting. This is the very first hand, and the ante in this case is 1,200. But actually down the road, the ante will be 4,200 or 4.2 big blinds, which is a very unusual structure, which we will talk more in this episode about. Now, one of the big questions that people have from the chat, the live chat, but also the comments afterwards, is how much of my own action do I have in this game? So first things first, my regular stake, the stake that I play the most hands in, is 2550 live PLO, 2550 100. The stack sizes there range anywhere between $5,000 and, let's say, $30,000 or $50,000. That's where I'm comfortable in. That's where I have my full own bankroll, so to speak, and that's where I play on my full own money. Now, if the stakes are massively bigger, like in this case, the stakes are 20 times bigger or 10 times bigger, I am responsible and in terms of my bankroll management, and I do take away some of the risk by selling some of the action, which means someone else will take part of my action. One of the frequent questions or suspicions was that Tony G on the table has actually my action, which is not true. Tony G does not have any piece of my action in this game. Just to be aware of that. Now, how much did I sell? I don't really want to disclose the exact amount. There are different deals that are of private nature behind the scenes. Different people buy different pieces, and I might not be in each game with the equivalent amount. But let's say in this game, my stake was large enough, that my contribution was large enough that this was easily the biggest game I've ever played, even after the fact that I sold some action. So you can do a bit of math and understand I had a pretty large piece of myself in this game. And now the way we basically put together the idea of playing here is that I do have $300,000 in my account to use. Again, some part of that money is my own money, some part is the action that I sold. And with $300,000, which are essentially 3 full binds at 100 big blinds each, we're going to play this game. Obviously, that's not too much to work with, but we're going to see where it goes. And the idea was also to buy in $60,000 at a time, which is what I followed. And that also allows for a couple of more buy-ins to begin with. So that is as much as my own stakes are concerned, or like how much money I had on the table, how much skin I have in the game? The answer is, and will also be in future live streams, I have a lot of skin in the game because I think that's much better content, but also because I love to play these games. I think it's a good game. It has a mix of recreational and professional players, and I feel comfortable playing the game, and I want to play for high stakes. And that being said, I don't necessarily want to take all my action because that is just such a big and large game that would be kind of irresponsible in terms of my bankroll to risk that much money completely by myself. Now, another question that came up, probably from like less regular viewers, you can say, is the money real? And a lot of people think the money is not real. I can guarantee you the money is real. This is real money. We're exchanging hundreds of thousands of dollars on the poker table. If you're newer to poker, you might think this is just a prop, or we're not playing for real money, or we're giving it back, or whatever it could be. This is not how it works. This is real money. There are people that are willing to risk hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions of dollars playing poker. And if you're not as used to poker, if you're not watching high stakes games on TV or on the internet here on the stream, then you might think this is not real. I can guarantee you this is real money. This is not a prop. This is real money. Another thing that people were asking before we're going to head into the hands here is some guys in the chat said the rake is really high in this game. And that is the furthest from the truth that it can actually be when it comes to the rake structure at nosebleed stakes on coin poker. So the way you want to think about the rake is always proportional to the big blind that you're playing at, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples here, bringing up different rake structures for you guys to understand. On coin poker, they call rake community contributions, but basically it is the same thing. It's just rake. And here you can see all the breakdown of how much rake they're taking. I'm going to give you some ideas here. So for example, at 10-20, right? This is no limit hold'em. Let's go to PLO or PLO players. At 10-20, the rake is 5%. And if 5, 6, or 7 players are sitting, the rake is capped at $10, right? Or 10 USDT. So that is half a big blind, right? So the cap is half a big blind. I'll give you a comparison here at 10-20 and GG Poker, the currently biggest site in the world. And if you look at the equivalent stake here at 10-20 for Pot Limit Omaha, then you will see that they have a 5% rake, but the cap is 1.5 big blinds, which in this case would be $30, right? So the rake cap, the maximum amount taken out of the pot, is 3 times larger on GG than on coin poker at the stake of 10-20 as an example, right? So if you play 10-20 and your rake cap is 0.5 big blinds or half a big blind, that is really good structure. Even if you were to play lower stakes, I mean, even better than if you play lower stakes and you would pay only half a big blind as a rake cap, that would be fantastic. That would be amazing. But there's almost no site that offers that. But it is quite common that as you move up in stakes, you essentially end up paying less and less in terms of the rake cap, which makes the game a lot more profitable. Now, how does it make the game a lot more profitable? Well, your win rate comes down to how many big blinds per 100 or how many big blinds per hand you can win. And you can imagine if you have an equivalent win rate at 10-20 and at, let's say, 1-2, which is over here, if the rake cap at 1-2 is 1.5 big blinds, $3, and at 10-20 it is only 0.5 big blinds, then having the same win rate on 1-2 and 10-20 leaves a lot more for yourself at 10-20 because the rake in proportion to the big blind size is a lot smaller, right? So the way you need to think about rake is proportionally to the big blind amount. Now, if we go up to high stakes, or you can say nosebleed stakes over here, the bottom, 400, 800, for example, in this case, we're playing 500, 1,000, then the rake cap is, let's say, $110. And you might think, wow, they're going to take $110 out of most of the pots. Isn't that very expensive? And again, if you think about $100, let's say $100 to simplify things, and a big blind of $1,000, that is only 10% of a big blind that you're getting capped at, which is an extremely low amount of rake for the size of the game. Anyone that can play at any stakes where the rake is only capped at 10% of the big blind is in fantastic conditions if they have an edge in the field to make a lot of money / make a lot of big blinds per 100. So this is an extremely soft, great condition for high stakes players to play at. And that's also one of the key reasons why at these stakes over here, or 5, 10 and up, there is a lot of action now converting from sites like GG Poker over to Coin Poker because the rake structure is a lot more attractive. Quick comparison here, once again, for nosebleed stakes before we're going to move over to the hands. If you look at the VIP games on GG at blinds 500, 1000, so basically the same thing, we have a 1 big blind cap, right? 1 big blind sounds like not a lot because it's described in big blinds, but the reality is the cap here is $1,000, and on Coin Poker the cap is about $100. That is a rake cap difference of 10 times the factor, right? A factor of 10 times. So again, if you think back about the comment that some people made in the chat, the rake is so high, how can they take $100 out of the pot? Well, guess what? On GG Poker, the rake is 10 times, the rake cap is 10 times larger at $1,000. Now, last excursion, if you think about private games, in Vegas, for example, there are a lot of high stakes private games, 500, 1000, or 200, 400, 400, 800. Very often in these private games, the rake will actually be capped at somewhere along the lines of $200 or $400, which is still, considering the stake and the softness of the game, a relatively low and acceptable rake. But once again, much, much higher than these games we can see here on screen on Coin Poker. So takeaway, especially at the mid stakes and high stakes and nosebleed stakes, the rake structure on Coin Poker is a lot lower than in the market overall, especially on GG, and that's what makes these games so attractive. So if you have an edge in this game, which I assumed I have, the rake is fantastic, phenomenal, amazing. I'm very happy to play in the game, happy to play here on Coin. Okay, I told you guys this is a nerd episode, right? So I'm going to answer like all the questions that people have, all the uncertainties, just to make sure we go through all the points. Now, the next thing I want to talk about before we're going to jump into these hands is the rakes, not the rake structure, the blind structure, right? So let's mute myself over here and fast forward. The table you see on screen right here, by the way, this is a recording of myself. I just cut myself out of the frame because otherwise you'll see myself twice, like here. And that would be quite weird, right? So anyway, this is just a recording of the last Sunday session. I'm going to wait for a hand where most players are dealt in, especially myself. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to get dealt in the big blind, the first hand. The one thing you will notice is that we have a large ante. So the ante in this case is $600, which is a bit more than a small blind. And that is very unconventional for lower stakes games. At lower stakes games, you usually have only a small and big blind, and that leads to a condition where you can play a lot tighter. Now, the more antes and straddles you have in the game, the more action you need to give as a player who wants to play profitable. Otherwise, you will get eaten up by the amount of antes and blinds you have to put on the table every single hand. So this structure here with this massive ante of more than a small blind incentivizes a lot of action, which is exactly what a good game should be built around. So PLO with high antes, great idea to put together. You do see this structure actually on app games where the players who create the games and the players who play the games are a bit closer in terms of understanding of what creates a great game with a lot of action. The only problem on app games is that there is a lot of rake. And if you pay a lot of rake and you need to play a lot of hands at the same time, because of the ante, you end up increasing your big blind rake contribution by a lot. And that oftentimes makes the game unprofitable. So be careful playing app games where the rake is very high. Plus you have high antes in the game as well. So that's not the case here because we pay almost no rake in terms of percentages as explained before. And this structure leads to a lot of action. But not only that, it also incentivizes every player to come into the pot so frequently that you can't only raise, you also have to start limping. I'm going to show this here in a sim. that I have prepared on PLO Trainer. So in PLO Trainer, which is our native software at PLOmastermind.com, we do have around 200 preflop solutions for all sorts of different structures, rake structures, as well as stack depths and antes and blinds and straddles, in order to cover all these different possible variations, live poker, online poker, and so on. So currently we are actually running specific sims for nosebleed stakes on coin poker as well as GG to add on, but they will take a while to finish. So in the meantime, I'm going to use a different structure here that we have created in the past for apps. So here we're looking at a high ante, 50 big blinds, that allows also for limps. So the structure in this game here is we are playing 50 big blinds each. There is 4 big blinds in the middle, which will be very similar to the actual game that will happen here in a second when all players are dealt in. The big blind, the ante will be 4 big blinds or 4.2 big blinds. So this is actually very similar to the actual game we're looking at. Now, the under the gun player has 2 options. He can limp or he can raise 3.5x. The ante is not included in the raise size, which is the way it works on coin poker. And we load now the solution. And the solution here shows us that we want to limp 30% of our range and raise only 5. So the under the gun player, by far, if he wants to play a hand, comes in for the limp, because the price to limp in, which is only 1 big blind, is so good that you don't want to limit yourself to play only raise. You want to play limp and raise. If you then look at something like the button's range, right? The button, if everyone ahead of him folds, should play almost 80% of the hands pre-flop and come in for a limp 73% of the time and raise only 3.8, right? So this sim has a bit of an issue in the sense that the small blind can raise, including the ante, but the gist of it is the same, which is the guy on the button will be in position and he has to risk only 1 big blind in order to play for a total pot size currently of 5.5 big blinds. Those are fantastic odds while being in position. So he wants to come in as often as possible, and raising will be too expensive. So that's why we will see a lot of limps. And this circles all the way back to one of the comments as well, one of the most liked comments in the chat or in the comment section after the fact, after the video, which was, in this game, I seem to play a lot more passive, and that is not my typical style. And that was meant as a negative, right? Like, oh, usually I played a lot more aggressive at my normal stake, but now I was scared and I played more passive in this game because I was afraid. But the reality is I did play a lot more passive pre-flop because that is what this specific rake structure incentivizes you to do. You can't just raise pre-flop all the time. There's too much out there. You got to come in for a limp with the majority of your VPIPing range. That is what the structure is suggesting. So you can't compare my regular game, my regular streams, and this game. Those are 2 separate games, so to speak. And I think with that, we can finally get into the hands, but I felt like this is definitely something important to mention, just to understand the whole setup of this dynamic here. Okay, let's get started. I marked out about 20 hands. Again, this is an absolute nerd episode. And if you guys are all about PLO, then you're going to love this. First hand, we see a raise and a 3-bet by Tony. So raise by Omaha. Let me just double check. Yeah, raise by Omaha, 3-bet by Tony. Call, flop is 10-9-6. You already noticed because we're playing short plus high ante, the SPR on the flop will be quite shallow. So stack to pot ratio is only 2. 10-9-6 rainbow benefits the call of the 3-bet a lot. He has more 10-9, 7-8, Queen, Jack, 9 kind of hands. And obviously Tony is supposed to have more aces. This is just quickly me switching to the 5K PLO tournament table. And we are not going to look at this hand for whatever reason. Okay, so first hand, where I actually have a hand, ace 10-8-7. And we see Tony comes in for close to a 3.5x raise, and we're in the small blind. This is a bit tricky. I just started the session. I did inform myself and worked a bit with the ranges before I head into this game. And I did know that I have to play looser, but I wasn't exactly sure how loose. We do see Mickey is limping, Tony with a small raise, and I have a decision to make here. If we look into the solution to replicate this scenario, we see a limp over here. I do imagine that Mickey limps a bit wider than this GTO range would suggest. So this would suggest that he limps like 30%, VPIP's around 36% in total. But I think more realistically, Mickey probably plays something along the lines of this, which will be a total of around 40% of the hands that come in. And then Tony comes in for this small ISO. Let's have a look what the button would ISO in terms of frequency. 13.5. He's probably going to be, we have to look at this from a bit of a different perspective. He's probably going to come in a bit wider. We're going to do this a bit different. We're going to say that we see a raise, a relatively tight raise over here and a call. And we're going to look how wide the small blind has to overcall in what will be very likely a multi-way pot. So 23% calls. Our hand is ace 10, 8, 7, triple suited nut. And our hand will be a call by the solver. And the EV here tells us that calling is about 0 EV, where folding on the left-hand side here would lose half a big blind, which is the half big blind we put in already. So calling here is going to be about half a big blind better than folding. And if you go back to the situation, you know, Mickey is one of the recreational players in the pool, and Tony makes it smaller than 3.5x. The ante is a bit bigger than 4x. So sometimes we don't have the perfect sim, even though we have 200 preflop sims in PLO Trainer, but we can use those sims in order to approximate what we should probably do. So I think this hand is better to call than fold. And this is like a first, you can say, minor mistake that I made just starting into the game. It will certainly not be the smallest mistake in the session, but it is a small sort of minor mistake, and we would have actually flopped really well here with a middle pair, the nut flush draw, and a gutter. But unfortunately, we ended up folding. In a normal game, by the way, this would not be a call in the small blind. You would just fold this hand against the MP open raise. And that's why it's sometimes tricky. You know, you play different formats. Live poker is what I play, but also online high stakes with 2 blinds where there's no ante. And now I'm playing this game. So the ranges are obviously different from each other, and it's difficult to play perfect at all instances. Anyway, we're going to move on to our next hand. I'm not going to go through all the hands because otherwise this will be a 4-hour video. Okay, so we wake up with ace king jack 10 rainbow, and we see a limp from Omaha Rolls. Omaha Rolls, one of the best PLO players in the world, and you see he comes in for the limp because he understands how the blind structure is created. So this limp should not be surprising at all to us now that we know more about how the sim looks like. And now the question is, should we limp? Should we raise with this hand? We're playing about 50 big blinds deep. In this instance, I decided to come in for the over limp, and we will see here in a sec that the solution disagrees with this and prefers to raise. And we're going to talk about this here for a moment. So we have ace jack 10 with a ace king jack 10 rainbow, and prefers to go for the raise. And if you look into the EV difference between raising and calling or over limping, then we see that about a 9 big blinds per 100 difference is given, which is a pretty small difference between the value of calling versus the value of raising. And when the EV difference is this small, then that is a signal to us as studied players that we have room for exploitation. We could follow the machine and say we're going to raise now, following the GTO solution. Or we could also say, given that the EV difference is tiny, that maybe calling is better because maybe in the blinds are players that are not as good as Omaha for rolls, and we want to come in for the over limp and get more players involved. I would say it's pretty reasonable to also limp here and not necessarily go heads up against Omaha for rolls. And another thing to consider is this hand is not a hand that wants to call a 3-bet. So if we think that the blinds might 3-bet us very light because they are more aggressive than GTO, they're overly aggressive, then raising over the limp will also get punished more often than in the machine. So anyway, this is a spot where we didn't do what the machine was suggesting, but actually here I would agree that it's a fine decision to take. We're going to move on to the next spot. Obviously here we're just giving up. Now we're going to move over to ace, queen, queen, 8. 50 big blinds. We have plenty of players behind. So we have 4 players behind us, and we have a decision to make on how to play this. Now, from these seats, these early position seats, we're going to play limp primarily. So if we look at the solution, shouldn't be too surprised to see us here with 4 players behind, which would be this position. Ace, queen, queen, 8 with a low suit. We will see that very few hands will be raising, and most hands we want to play will limp. So ace, queen, queen, 8 will be a pure limp, like all these combos will be limping. But in this instance, we decided to go for the raise. And my logic basically was that twofold. Number one, I preferably play this hand against 1 player. And number 2, I do think given my image, which is that I am a new player in this game and probably sold some action and I'm streaming, so I'm going to be quite careful in their eyes, that I will not get 3-bet very light. Now, if you raise this hand and you get 3-bet, it's a very tricky spot because you perform so bad against aces and ace, king, king. And on the other side, if your opponent's 3-bet you light with a rundown hand, then you make a big mistake by folding. So the GTO solution actually prefers to limp with this hand, like with many other hands, and then go for a limp raise in order to get all the money in. And that way, we don't play against a 3-betting range once we face a raise, but we face against an ISO raising range, which is wider than a 3-betting range. So this hand prefers to go limp raise all in, or limp raise playing for stacks, but is very uncomfortable playing raise and facing 3-bet. So I think in hindsight, I like the idea of limping better if I knew the solution. Obviously, in game, I didn't. But on the other side, in this case, we do get 3-bet by Mickey on the button. And I do know a bit about Mickey's play pre-flop, and I think that we're going to run into a very aces-heavy range here when getting 3-bet. And therefore, I make a fold. And this is a table format where you will see whoever wins the hand, you will see the showdown of the player or a showdown of the player that wins the hand regardless if the hand went to showdown. So we fold here, a very tight fold at 50 big blinds, but we do get to see our opponent's whole cards. And in this case, we ran into the aces that completely crush us, also with the better suits or with covered suits, the ace-5 of diamonds. So we raised and made a really good fold against a 3-bet. So far I'm happy. But again, we're still getting used to this very unusual structure that we are playing. All right, next, let's move over to our next hand. Comes in 8 minutes into the stream. Move on over here. Okay, so what do we have? We have a 3x open, a call, and we're closing the action. So we have to call 2,000 for a 15K pot. Very good pot odds. And the main thing you want to ask yourself is our hand nutted enough? Can we make the nuts on some very few flops that we're happy calling? Jack 10 is an interesting 2-card combo because it does make a lot of nut straights. 3-5, not amazing. Obviously, the low spades are quite problematic. So let's have a look what the solution says. We do see a 3.5x open. There's a call. There's a call on the button, and now it's up to us. Now, one thing you will notice here is that we're folding 35.9% in this setup. If you were to face only one raiser, so let's say under the gun raises and it's folded all the way to us, we're going to fold 7.9%. So a common misconception in PLO is that when your pot odds get better, you play more hands pre, which is disproven very easily, as you can see right here. And what's the logic behind it? Well, if you play against more players post, you also have to beat more players post-flop. And in PLO, when you go to the flop 4 ways, the way you can continue against aggression or aggress yourself is by having a nutted hand. So hand selection pre-flop against multiple players or in multi-way pots is a lot more important than against one player. If you play against one player, the driving factor for defining the big blind will be your pot odds. If you play against multiple players, the driving factor will be the characteristics of your hand. So if you go back to the actual spot, we face a raise, 2 callers, and we look then at Jack 10-5-3. We notice that our hand does not want to call. Our hand is somewhere here on the left. We have the exact hand is Jack 3. The Jack and the 3 are suited. So let's have a look at the Jack and the 3. The EV difference here is about 15 big blinds per 100. It's not a huge EV difference, and the driving factor here for defending or not could be who is in the pot. Now, in this instance, we do face a slightly smaller open than 3.5x. The ante is slightly larger than in the sim. We have one recreational player in the pot, but also two probably really good players. So this is a quite iffy spot. It is close, but I think calling is defendable. Folding is fine as well. We flop a flush 4 ways. And we check the flop. We have by far the least amount of nut flushes in our preflop range, given that we defend so many hands pre. And we see a check around on the flop. Now, turn is a 5. Do we feel like we have the best hand here? We might have the best hand, but on the other side, all these players can easily still have the nut flush. And if they would have a king high flush or a queen high flush, the standard on the play, the standard line in a 4-way pot will be to check the flop. It is not a hand that 4 ways, let's say you have a king high flush or a queen high flush, it's not a hand class you want to bet the flop and then trying to get all the money in the middle, at least not by default. The hand is just not strong enough, and you will not get called by a weaker hand often enough to justify that. So on the turn, my thinking is I probably have the best hand, but betting here is going to be too thin. You always have to think about the thin line between how much value is there denying equity and getting hands to fold, such as 2 pair or a set here, versus building a pot against a potentially better hand, and also versus a bluff catching against hands that can still take a stab now. So we check because I think denying equity here is really not as valuable, especially for the kind of non-nutted hand class that I have. I just want to check and see how things develop for one more street. Certainly, if I wouldn't see a bet on the turn, I would bet myself on the river. I mean, it depends what the river is, but on most rivers I would. Anyway, we see a 1/3 sizing from the button. Casca is betting, and this is definitely congruent with a king high or queen high flush. It could also be a king high or queen high blocker, but that's by far the most dense part of his range. If he happened to have a straight, for example, it doesn't make a lot of sense to bet into 3 opponents because by the time he gets called, he's usually behind. Also, a straight doesn't need to defend against a lot of hands. A set just wants to see a free card because it's going to run into a flush too often. So this hand here, him betting the turn basically is indicating to me that he has a better flush than me or one of the key blockers to a better flush, but not much else. So recall because we're getting a good price and obviously we're still beating bluffs. Not like the other 2 players didn't show interest on the flop or the turn. The river breaks kind of, it's a king. Now the reason why I say kind of is because one of the hands that he could have that is bluffing is pocket kings with the king of spades. If you happen to have a hand like king, king, jack, 4, for example, pre-flop, single suited, he might just have the king of spades and decided to turn that king of spades into a bluff on the turn. Now, the river changes things a little bit because king, king with the king of spades is now beating 2 pairs and sets on the river. And the solver would oftentimes not bluff the river anymore because this hand now has showdown value and can win against some parts of my range. I can easily have 9-9, 6-6, 4-4, 5-5 that calls on the turn, or a hand like 3 or 4 pair that he now beats. So actually what this card does is it takes away some of the bluffs that my opponent had on the turn, but all the value is still in that range. So we will see a bet here of half pot, and this bet indicates to me that he has a flush. Now, if we think he has either a flush or a high spade blocker like the ace of spades, probably not as often, but more like a king of spades or queen of spades as a blocker, then we need to ask ourselves a couple of things. The first thing we want to ask ourselves is, how often does he have a blocker versus the actual flush? Actually, let's start with a different question first. If he has a flush, right, how often does he have a better flush than a worse flush than myself? And this is a bit tricky, I would say, for people that are not as used to the combinatorics of PLO. But in PLO, you need 2 cards to a flush, right? So you need a king of spades and a queen of spades, or a king of spades and a deuce of spades. And in this case, it's not like you would say, well, the only flushes that beat you are king high flush, or let's say ace high flush, king high flush, and queen high flush. Those are 3 cards. and all the cards below your flush, so the 10 high flush, the 8 high flush, the 7 high flush, the 5 high flush, and the 3 high flush, and those are all cards below you. So therefore he has more bluffs than value. That's not how combinatorics work, right? Because when you have the king high flush, you can have king queen of spades, king jack is not possible, but king 10 of spades, king 8 of spades, king 7 of spades, and the same thing is true for the queen high flush and for the ace high flush. So actually I did the math here a little bit, and how often does this player have a better flush versus a worse flush if we only look at the flushes? And the answer is he's probably going to have a better flush about 75% of the time and a worse flush about 25% of the time in this case. So if you put him on a flush, it's actually kind of a break-even call, because we're getting about we're getting here about 3-1, right? So we need to be right about 25% of the time. But is he actually betting the unlikely, let's say, 7-8 of spades, the unlikely 8 high flush or 7 high flush or 5 high flush? Pretty unlikely, in my opinion, that those hands are value betting. So he probably is more polarized and has something like a king high flush or queen high flush, or again, one of those blockers. And in this case, it is just much more likely that he has the actual flush, and there are a couple reasons for that. One was the king-king thing, right? Like if he has king-king, he might not bluff on the river because he actually improved to a set. But another one is the preflop range here. If you look back at what happened preflop, is pretty interesting to observe. So preflop, we see an under the gun open and a call. And because they're playing 50 big blinds deep, a lot of the double suited hands that usually 3-bet in a 100 big blind scenario, for example, Jack 10, 9, 8, or a hand like King, Queen, Jack 10 double suited, a lot of those hands might actually not 3-bet in this instance, and because they're so short, and I don't think there's a lot of fold equity. We're also playing 7-handed. So in my imagination, the way this co-calling range works is that there are a lot more double suited hands in there that might not be in that range if you were to look at a 100 big blind range, which is what most people are kind of used to. So this is, in my mind, a very double suited heavy range. Sure, there are some kings and queens in there. We already spoken about the king-king combos, but it is overall kind of a thin decision on the river. We could call or we could fold, hoping to see, again, the naked king of spades, queen of spades. Maybe one thing to be said about that is if he happens to have the naked king of spades or queen of spades, he usually has the side cards that we have, which is the jack and the 10. So you would have a hand like king, queen, jack 10 with the king of spades, or queen, jack 10, 9 with the 10 of spades, queen of spades. So he basically very often has the single spade combo with the jack and the 10 that we kind of have. Holding the jack of spades is not that relevant. Like, it's not really part of the value betting range in my mind. So we ended up making the fold here, and this was a very unfortunate spot because we ended up running into the 10 high flush. So this is an example hand. Like, this is a hand that could certainly squeeze at 100 big blinds, but 50 big blinds deep, it loses a lot of the deception and therefore chooses to just flat. And that's why I deemed this range to be much more double suited pre-flop, which is probably correct. It is just that in this case, he kind of had the weakest value bet he would probably have ever. And it was just 1 pip lower than my hand. So pretty unfortunate. But this is basically the logic that goes behind it. So folding the river here, not much regret about it. I think that when you look at all his value bets, we just ran into the absolute bottom of it. And that, it feels worse than it is in actuality. Here we defend King, Queen, 4, 3 double suited in the small blind. This is also a correct defend. Not too interesting of a hand. We're going to move on to the next one, which is over here. Not this one, but the one that follows. So we wake up with ace 8-8-5, and a very unlikely scenario happens here. If we know, again, how the sim looks like, the button is probably supposed to limp, or play somewhere along the lines of 75% of the hands, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. But everyone folds, and now it's up to us, and we have to call 500 to win 5,700. Now you might think, who cares? We have a good hand, let's raise. But the thing is, you need to understand how your range plays before how you can play a hand. In this case, in this case, I'm supposed to like limp basically any hand because I'm getting better than 10 to 1 to see a flop. So the general strategy here would work in a way that I limp everything. And then when Tony raises against such a weak range, I have a solid amount of limp re-raises. Here is a sim that sort of illustrates this idea. Let me just bring this up. It's very unusual that you get 10 to 1 in the small blind first in. Here is a sim that basically illustrates the whole thing. 4 big blinds are dead in the middle. We're playing blind on blind, 50 big blinds deep, and we're supposed to fold 0.1% of the hands pre, limp 91.6, and raise 8.3. So there are some raises in there. What about ace 8-8-5 double? Supposed to be a limp as well. Is also a hand that plays really awkward against a 3-bet. So we just limp. And if Tony raises, again, in this sim, we do see a larger raise than actually possible. We end up having some limp raises in there, some calls, but also a bunch of folds. In actuality, we would see a much smaller raise and we would have less folds. But I think the point is clear. We want to call here the majority of our range pre and then have a good amount of limp re-raises. So we come in for the limp, getting more than 10 to 1. Tony goes for, I think, a raise. Is our hand good enough to limp raise? I think it's a bit too thin. If I had a hand like ace 9-9-8, for sure I would limp raise, or a hand like ace 8-8-7, maybe. A hand like ace 10-10-8 double for sure. But ace 8-8-5 is a bit thin. Flop comes king 6-3. We check. We don't have a lot of bets here. He's going to have more king-king. He's going to have more nut flushes. He's going to have more top pairs. And Tony bets large and quick. Now, the solver doesn't want to raise here because our hand is basically ahead of all the bluffs. If he has ace high or non-paired hand, we are doing really well. And if he has a good hand, then we are fine just calling and seeing some turns. However, what happens here is that if you look at a GTO solution, like this range here in position shouldn't just like fire with hands such as pocket aces or just the king. It should be a lot more selective and careful, because if he fires a hand like, let's say, ace 10-9 with clubs, and he gets raised on the flop, he can easily get raised off his hand, holding the best hand, by a draw. And continuing ace 10-9 on the flop against a check raise full pot is not a profitable proposition. So basically what happens is my estimation of how Tony would play this spot is here to bet very often. And if that is true and he's betting king X a bit loosely and ace a bit loosely and some bluffs a bit loosely, then check raising the flop here makes my life a lot easier. And I can just generate a lot of fold equity while ending the hand at this point. Even if he wants to jam, we still have at least the nut flush outs, but probably an 8 is good as well. We have some running straight cards. So we're never dead. I think in my mind, we have a lot of fold equity. And we also remove the disadvantage of being out of position for the turn in the river, because we're basically going to be all in. So I knew in game this is not a GTO check raise, but I felt like it was a good exploit in this case. And we take down the pot. Let's move on to more hands. I'm not going to go through all the hands that I marked down, I guess, because some of them are just basic pre-flop spots that we already discussed plenty. This might be an interesting one to quickly look into. So this is 30 minutes into the session. We do see a 3.5x open by Mickey. And as we saw before in the preflop solution, we almost fold never in this case because we're playing against one player only. We learned now more about the principle of how pot odds matter in heads-up situations a lot more than multi-way. So this is just solid call. I looked this up in the solution. It's a solid call pre-flop, and we do flop a flush draw. Check. We have 3 hearts. Mickey bets kind of large and fast. We don't really have many options here but to call and see how things develop. So that's what we're doing. Oh, so we call. The turn is the 9. So we do improve to a double gut shot, a 5 to a straight, a 10 to a straight. But it goes check, check, and the river is an ace. And now we have the nut suddenly. And the ace is going to give Mickey a lot of showdown value. He's going to have ace X, maybe a hand like aces or ace king. ace 9, ace 7 is possible. He didn't bet the turn, so he doesn't have kings. He doesn't have king 9, he doesn't have king 7, and so on. But he definitely has ace king, ace ace, ace 9, ace 7. And we want to bluff. Now, the solution, the GTO solution, generally recommends to bet small when you have 3 hearts in this case, because when Mickey decides to hero call the river against a bet, he should, in theory, make his decision based on how many blockers to a flush he has. So if Mickey has aces with the jack of hearts, or aces with the queen of hearts, or aces with the 5 of hearts, he's supposed to call a lot more likely than if he doesn't have a heart at all. Us having a lot of hearts means that we're basically removing a lot of the snap calls, a lot of the premium bluff catchers out of Mickey's range. So the solver kind of recommends to go smaller here sometimes because of that reason. Now, what we have to ask ourselves exploitatively is, if Mickey happens to have ace king or ace ace, is he ever folding even if we bet large? And if the answer is no, if he's going to call 16k, 17k here with a hand like aces anyway, even if there's no heart, then going bigger is better. And so in game, I decided I'm going to go for the small bet, trying to get paid here for the, again, removal of premium blocker effects or removal of premium bluff catchers, and with a 3-heart combo. And Mickey goes into a tank and ends up folding. I don't think for this sizing he folds ace king or better. Probably just an ace or maybe just the king. But yeah, that's basically where the logic comes from. Now here we are short stack on the secondary table. We have double suited queens on something like 17, 18 big blinds. We raise over a limp. This is a great flop. There's no overpair. We have top pair, 2 backdoor flush draws. Only 13k left. Easy all in. And it's really hard to like miss this spot. We just have a great hand pre and post, or a good hand post. Unfortunately, we get called by 2 players, which is never good with this hand in this turn. And the way this hand plays out is that they check down the pot, and Sam happens to dominate me, unfortunately, with ace king 7-4, and we lose against king 7, so 2 pair. And that was our first 60k stack that is gone. Okay, I think we're going to cut this video here. I will do a second episode right away, but the video is already 45 minutes long. If you like this episode, hit the thumbs up. I'm going to do more episodes and release it here on YouTube step by step, also including our $240,000 pot that we played. Will be released very soon here on YouTube. If you like it, subscribe and like. And obviously, if you want to play on CoinPoker yourself, coinpoker.com/ or coinpoker.com, and use the sign-up code JNandez in order to join our leaderboard. In the past, we gave away $2,000 a month to people that are tagged under the JNandez code. But next month and the following months, we're going to give away $5,000 to exclusively people that are tagged to JNandez on CoinPoker. So make sure, if you want to play, use the sign-up code JNandez. We see each other in the next episode, guys. The next episode will probably release after the Sunday stream. So Sunday, 10 a.m. Vegas time, 6 p.m. UK time, the next high-stakes stream. Hopefully, I've enjoyed this first episode of the breakdown, the nerd episode. I'll see you guys out there soon. GG, take care, and good luck at the tables.